Look, I know studying isn't exactly the most exciting thing in the world, but since we have to do it, we might as well make it easier for ourselves, right? So let's set aside all the methods that don't work and start using the ones that actually do. Number one is what I like to call intentional elaboration. This is where I sprinkle in a little wisdom from Richard Feynman, who developed the Feynman technique, and he said the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. I think that resonates with everyone. When it comes to studying, we tend to fool ourselves all the time. We tend to trick ourselves into thinking that we understand the concept just because we read it a few times. But again, feeling a sense of familiarity on a concept doesn't equate to mastery of that concept. The second we try to explain it, I can 100% bet that we will find ourselves hitting a mental block, stuttering, not knowing what's next. To actually remember and understand what you're learning, practice intentionally elaborating. Try to understand the branching leaves of knowledge that make a concept what it is. Instead of just memorizing or rereading your notes, ask yourself the questions why and how. Now, if this is what elaboration means, where then does being intentional come in? Well, when we research a specific concept, it's easy to be distracted. One search can lead to another. 30 minutes later, you find yourself reading a different topic only to ask yourself, why was I even searching this in the first place? Being intentional means asking the right questions. For example, when I was studying the different types of photosynthesis, C3, C4, and CAM, I knew it was much easier to just memorize the pathways. Compound A reacts with compound B producing compound C, etc., etc. That shallow method of memorization would probably help me pass the quiz, but I probably wouldn't be able to remember these concepts for the exam at the end of the semester. So instead, I ask the questions why and how. Why does this happen? How does this work? How do these pathways differ from each other? After researching these questions, I try to write what I've learned on a piece of paper while explaining it in my own words. If I find myself struggling at any point, I go back, study that concept again until I can explain the entirety of that concept in my own words. By doing this, I was able to work on the areas I was still struggling with, and I can approach the exam a little less nervous and a little more knowledgeable. So if you find yourself thinking, this is probably enough, this won't appear in the exam anyway, remember, you are the easiest person to fool. Next, the theory of dual coding. This is a method of using both words and visuals to learn and retain information. How does this work? According to Alan Pavio, the proponent of this theory, our brains have two systems for processing information, one for words and one for visuals. These systems, although separate, can work hand in hand to store information in our long-term memory. So instead of just memorizing a long paragraph about a certain concept, pair it with diagrams, graphic organizers, or mind maps. Your brain now has two ways to encode and remember the same information, making it easier to recall later on. One of the best ways to practice dual coding is by using Scrintal, which I am so happy to be today's sponsor. Scrintal is a visual note-taking app that lets you combine text and visuals when studying. For example, if I'm studying about the different types of immune cells, I can read an entire section of a book explaining each of them in detail, but that probably wouldn't stick, and I probably would have a hard time remembering all of them. So instead, in Scrintal, I can create two main blocks for the main categories and individual blocks beneath each of them for the specific immune cell types. Within each block, I can write as much information as needed. These can be different forms of text and different formats of media. I can even form connections between each block, allowing me to see how one cell type is related to another. By using Scrintal, I am able to take advantage of the organization of the text and the accompanying visuals to understand the lesson. Now, I have somewhat of a study map that helps me see exactly how everything connects together in a way that makes sense to my brain. So if you find yourself struggling to remember lengthy topics and complex concepts, try dual coding with Scrintal. It's a simple yet powerful tool to ensure what you learn stays in your memory. I leave a link in the description below so you can try Scrintal out. I also have a discount code that is Patrisha30 for 30% off your first subscription period. Other than that, let's go ahead and talk about our next tip. Interleaving. This is basically just a fancy way of saying you must study alternating topics instead of focusing on just one at a time. Instinctively, I think most of us tend to study in blocks, or at least I did before. During exam season, I would study one course at a time. Biology for the first 3 days, chemistry for the next 3, and physics for the last 3 days. This was much easier to do because I was mastering only one subject area at a time. However, research shows that we actually learn less from block practice. Across all studies, the setup was essentially the same. Two groups of students are subjected to either blocked or interleaved learning. Regardless of the subject area, whether language, science, math, or physics, the results were consistent. Students tested with interleaved practice performed way better than those who studied in blocks. Most students tend to stray away from interleave practice because it can be more difficult than studying in blocks. Mixing up topics or subjects during a review session feels much more challenging, and we students tend to avoid that. Of course, we don't want to make studying way harder than it already is. But that difficulty, that strain, is actually what's training your brain to recall information better. You are training your brain to switch its gears so you don't get thrown off by a mix of questions, especially during exams. So instead of studying just one course after another, this was how I revised my study schedule. If I have 3 exams on the same day, I'll spread out the lessons for each course throughout the week, ensuring I dedicate at least 2 days to studying each lesson. Inevitably, of course, some lessons from the 3 courses would overlap, but fret not, because that is the essence of interleaving. I'm studying each course in shorter chunks, training my brain to retrieve specific information in different contexts. Now, let's talk about memory techniques. In my last video, and hopefully by now, I've made it clear that understanding is the foundation of learning. Nothing matters more in studying than understanding. But sometimes, memorization is still necessary. Some types of exams, some professors would still require you to memorize a long list of names. So yes, you may understand a lesson inside out, but if you can't recall specific names, dates, and terms, especially when you need them, it also won't do you much good. Memorization, however, I repeat, should only supplement understanding. You shouldn't be overly reliant on memorization alone. Had to wait for the sun to calm down a little bit. Hopefully this is better. So one strategy is the use of mnemonics. The most common one, acronyms. And this has been proven to be an effective way to recall information. Mnemonics are subjective, they're personal and flexible. There are well-known mnemonics out there for different subjects, but there is no one formula that works for everyone. You can use mnemonics to create meaning that makes the most sense to your brain. For example, in high school, there was a mnemonic we used for taxonomic classification. So instead of memorizing kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we instead memorized King Philip came over for good soup. Because this was more meaningful and because this made more sense, it helped to recall the information and the hierarchy of classification later on. Another strategy is the memory palace. From its name, you basically visualize a palace and then you associate certain locations or certain objects within that palace with specific terms, specific concepts. So when you need to recall the information, you just mentally walk through your memory palace, and each object or location will basically trigger the memory of what's stored there. For example, if I'm walking through my bedroom, I can associate my laptop with the nucleus, the power plug with the mitochondria, and the walls with the cell membrane. This makes it more meaningful to remember. Finally, yet importantly, the study cycle. If you are looking for a step-by-step beginner's guide to studying, this is exactly what you need. The study cycle outlines the core of learning, but this is also, I think, the most overlooked, undervalued, downplayed aspect of studying. So the cycle essentially enumerates the 5 fundamental steps in learning: preview, attend, review, study, and assess. Number 1, preview. Before the start of every class, skim through your textbook. Take a look at the slides for the day. Most students, myself included, tend to skip this step because we have this mindset of, this will be covered during the class anyway. But when we come to class without having any sort of knowledge about what the lesson is, we tend to feel overwhelmed by the amount of new information, leading most of us to feel unengaged during the lecture. Having an overview of what the lesson is, how the lesson is structured, however, prepares you better for the class. If you can, and if you have the luxury of time, highlight specific terms that you find difficult to understand. This will help you pay attention to these concepts later on during class. Second, attend the class. Might seem like an obvious, superficial tip, but you'd be surprised by how many students zone out during lectures. Listen attentively, think of examples, think of relations to previous lessons you've learned, or better yet, ask questions. The more you actively listen during class, the less time you'll need to study afterwards. Third, review. Immediately? Not necessarily, but it is recommended that you do it the sooner you can. Why? Well, this follows the principle of spaced repetition, studying your lessons in intervals to reinforce your memory of that lesson. Think about it. You study before the class, you study in class, and you study after the class. Repeatedly exposing yourself to the lesson cements that lesson in your mind. So when you have to study later on, you don't have to put too much energy trying to recall everything all at once. Fourth, study. Again, spaced repetition. Distribute your review sessions over time. These sessions don't have to be an hour or 3 hours long. 30 minutes going over the lesson, filling in the gaps in your memory should be enough as long as you space out these review sessions. sessions. The last step of the cycle, assess. Assess what you've learned and assess how you study. Whether it's through flashcards, practice problems, testing yourself allows you to see what you actually know versus what you just think you know. Aside from that, evaluate whether your study methods are still working for you. When we stick with a study technique for a while, it's easy to fall into this trap of trusting it blindly. We convince ourselves that it's effective even when it no longer yields the results we want. Take the time to pause, sit back, and ask yourself, are these learning strategies still helping me to become a better learner? Those are all of the tips I have for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for sticking around. I decided to finally switch out the neutrals, the browns, with something more colorful, so I hope you like it. And other than that, I will see you guys in my next one. Bye!